I'm Linda Vester. For a decade, I worked at NBC News as an anchor and correspondent. I was groped and assaulted by Tom Brokaw, then the anchor of NBC Nightly News. This is my story. I was a brand new, newly hired correspondent for NBC News for Weekend Today. And I was sent to Denver in August of '93 to cover the Pope's trip there. And while I was standing in the Denver bureau with my back to the door, from behind me, out of nowhere, Tom Brokaw walked up, put his hands on my waist, and tickled me all up and down my waist. It was physically unpleasant and humiliating. I jumped a foot. I looked at the editor of Nightly News in the eye. He looked back at me, and his jaw dropped. And I was completely humiliated in front of a room full of my colleagues. I jumped, got out of the way, got out of his grasp. No one did a thing. And there was really nothing I could say or do because I was so low on the totem pole that I had just had to get out of there as quickly as possible and try to go on and do my job covering the Pope. I was in New York on assignment. I was wrapping up my work for the day, getting ready to leave, and late in the afternoon, I started getting these computer messages from Tom Brokaw. It said his name. And it was asking me, where was I staying tonight? What were my travel plans? And that was very odd because I was the most junior correspondent at the network. I reported for a completely different broadcast. I didn't work on his broadcast. There would be no reason for him to be interested. And we didn't know each other. So it was strange. And I was immediately nervous that he was asking about my travel plans. So I said that I was planning to take the last shuttle back to DC. He said I'd advise against that. And I thought that was odd, but I presumed that maybe he thought it was risky to fly in a snowstorm or something. And I got worried enough that I called a colleague in the Washington bureau who was a friend. And I asked her for her assessment of the messages. I read them to her verbatim. And she said, he's hitting on you. That's bad. You need to get out of there. And so I said, well, I'm definitely going to make the 9 o'clock shuttle. And he said, what about drinks? And then he wrote, nah, too risky. And I struggled to think of how I could signal him to go away without offending or angering the single most powerful man at the network. So I tried an attempt at humor, and I said, I only drink milk and cookies. And what I was trying to do in a humorous, inoffensive way, non-confrontational way, was to say, not only am I not interested, but I'm 30 years younger than you. And then I purposely logged off so that he could see on the computer screen that I was not available for further conversation. I gathered my things, I left, went to dinner at the apartment of my parents' friends, and then I went to catch the 9 o'clock shuttle back to DC, but it was canceled due to snow. So I went back to my hotel room, checked back in to the hotel, and started returning business phone calls. And then I got 3 phone calls, one from a friend, one from a source, and the third one was from Brokaw. And he said to order milk and cookies, and he would be coming over. And I felt trapped because it wasn't a request, it was more of an order. And I felt like this man could destroy my career. So if he said he's coming over, I have to let him come over. He's the most important man at NBC News. I was terrified. So I called the same colleague in the Washington bureau, asking her what should I do? How do I protect myself? How do I get out of this situation safely? And she said, well, maybe he'll think better of it. Maybe he'll realize this is inappropriate and he'll change his mind and he won't show up at your hotel. Or if he does, he'll call up from the lobby and you can say, I don't think this is a good idea, or I fell asleep, or anything to get yourself out of it. And she said, just to keep you calm, I'm going to stay on the phone with you and make sure this all ends up okay. So she and I are chatting, and then there's a knock at the door. And she heard it through the phone, and I went completely cold because I knew it had to be Brokaw. And she said to me on the phone, okay, you have 30 minutes to get him out of there and call me back to reassure me that you are safe. And if I don't hear from you in 30 minutes, I'm calling security. And I said, okay. I hung up the phone. I opened the door. And Tom walked right past me and sat down on the sofa. I did not join him on the sofa at this point. I was standing there. Actually, as he was walking in, I said, what are you doing here? And he said, oh, I was at my stage manager's retirement party. I was in the neighborhood. And he sat down, and say he was here on the sofa. I was standing about 5 feet away, and at this point I'm shaking. And I said, what do you want from me? And he had his arm back like this, and he said, an affair of more than passing affection. And I said, but you're married, and I'm Catholic. And he gave me this look of such annoyance. And he said, don't tell me you're like Russert. This was a reference to Tim Russert, who was the host of Meet the Press and was very well known to be very Catholic. And I said, I am. And at that point, he patted the sofa for me to come and sit down. And I didn't know how I was going to say no to sitting down. So I sat down and I grabbed a throw pillow. I jammed myself up against the back of the sofa, if this is the side of the sofa, and he's sitting over there. I grabbed the throw pillow and I'm like this to show with all the body language I can muster that I'm terrified, I don't want him here, I'm not interested. He actually said, I liked our rat-a-tat-tat. And I looked at him like, what does that mean? But I thought he was trying to refer to the computer messages, trying to make it sound like we were flirting when I wasn't. As I'm trying to show him, I'm so not interested and I'm so scared. I actually decided to be more direct, and I brought up a case of sexual harassment, a recent case of sexual harassment at NBC News that had caused the victim a lot of pain. And at that point, he leans over with his index finger and puts it on my mouth to silence me and says, this is our compact. And at that point, he took the same hand, reached behind my head, and tried to force me to kiss him. I pulled back with all the strength I could muster and stood up. And I said, Tom, I do not want to do this with you. If I were to go down this road with you, I would have such a sense of loss, a loss of innocence. And after what seemed like an eternity, he said, I guess I should go. And I nodded my head and I said, you want me to nod some more? And then he got up from the sofa and grabbed his coat and on the way out tried to kiss me as he walked out the door. I stood there for a couple of minutes and just shook out of sheer panic. And then I called my colleague in Washington and said, I'm safe, and told her word for word exactly what had happened, and took notes for everything that had happened. I always keep notes as a reporter. The next day, I took the first shuttle back to Washington, my home base, and I started getting a volley of computer messages across the top of the screen from Tom Brokaw. And I was so disgusted by his behavior and upset by all he had tried to do that I refused to answer his messages all day. And then finally he sent a message saying, I want to lower the temperature on this. Call me. And he wrote his extension. And that, to me, sounded like a direct order. And maybe the possibility of an apology. So I called his extension. And instead of an apology, what he tried to do was reframe the narrative. Make it sound like it was somehow consensual at some point, and I was not buying that. I was not, because it was in no way ever consensual. But I didn't say anything because he could ruin my career. I was deeply traumatized by being groped and assaulted by Tom Brokaw. Much of my work for NBC was going to war zones and being in positions of real danger. I was nearly blown up twice. I was carjacked. I had so many close scrapes. And had some transient PTSD, but it was not a fraction of the PTSD I have suffered from this. And it's really important that employers get that, and NBC gets that. Even though I know I was not in any way at fault in what happened to me with Tom Brokaw, I still suffered years of humiliation, isolation, and shame. Because of his power, I was unable to talk about it. So I was silenced. And there was nothing I could do to seek recourse, because to have done so at NBC would have been the end of my